Hello and welcome to our second video blog. Today we're going to talk about something that's very, very, very important in ministry. And we're going to talk about don't lose your altar. And we're going to be coming from Genesis chapter number 13, verses number 1 through verses number 4. And I'm reading out of the New King James Version, but whatever version you have you can read out of, it'll mean the same. Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, to the south. Abraham was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So let's talk about Abram for a second. Abram was a man of unshakable faith. He was a great intercessor, a man of great convictions, very, very, very wealthy. Even in that scripture it says Abraham was he was very rich in livestock and in silver and in gold. He had a great friendship and relationship with God. He was a man of many, 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 many promises, but he did not get entangled in the promise, but got entangled in the promiser, which was God, which caused him to have a great relationship with God. But his greatest accomplishment is that he had an altar. An altar is a place of sacrifice. It's a place where your life can be altered. It is a place of communion with God. It's a place where you can shut yourself in and shut everyone else out. It is a place to give thanks. Abram, in this particular chapter, in these particular scriptures, is on a journey. But in the midst of the journey, he realizes that he must get back to the altar. See, on this journey, he was doing very good until he got down in Egypt. Egypt is a type of bondage. He went down in Egypt. God's friend, a man of character, found himself in a system of idolatry, a place where he had become overwhelmed by his surroundings and circumstances. And a man of faith had now turned into a man of fear. He offered his own wife. This is how scared he was. He offered his own wife because he thought, when they asked him, was this his wife, that if he said yes, they would kill him so that they could have access to his wife. So instead, he began and said that this is my sister. You see, when you get into a place where you are no longer where your altar is, or your altar is lost, fear takes over, lies takes over. It makes you in a place where you lose your convictions and your standards. Abram was terrified for his own well-being, so he offered up his wife. In the place of an altar, you put yourself above other people. And so an altar is a place where you can get counsel, wisdom, direction, and favor. And so when it's gone, you can't get those things. An altar is a place in your heart that only you offer to God. It is a place where you sacrifice yourself unto God. See, we've gotten into this religious box that makes us think that an altar is the steps, the part in front of a stage or a pulpit, and that's not true. But it's the place in your heart. It is where you're transparent before God. It is a place of humility and resignation. It's a place of resolve and a place of recognition where you can recognize all that God has done for you. Many great people in the Bible had an altar. Abram had an altar. Noah had an altar. Moses had an altar. Joshua had an altar. Gideon had an altar. Saul had an altar. David had an altar. When Noah came out of the ark after the great flood, he came out not to build a church, not to build a business, not to build a ministry, not to get people, but he came out and built an altar to where he can give thanks for God bringing them through the flood. So an altar is very important in the things that we're doing. And in ministry, you can't be a minister, a preacher, a pastor, a leader, a praise and worship leader without an altar. You can't lead praise dance. You can't lead choir without an altar, because when you're getting up there, it's not you. It is your altar that you are placing on the line. When I get up there and preach, it's not me, but it's the place where I go in my heart to find God, and that's what I'm transparent and I'm conveying to the people that is listening. So you must realize that when you're a person in ministry, you must not lose your altar, because when you lose your altar, everyone connected to you may lose theirs. When you're in a place of leadership, you're in a place where people are relying on you. People are looking up to you, even if you know it or not. Whether you are in a leader in a church setting, or if you're a leader in school, or if you're a leader in your community, whether you're not looked at as a leader, you don't have a title of a leader, but you have the position of a leader, people are still looking to you. So you can't lose your altar, because when you lose your altar, you lose your place of convictions. You lose your place of standards. You lose the very place in which makes you unique as a Christian. And God talks about this. God talks about this in Ezekiel. Turn with me to the book of Ezekiel. And I love the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a great man. He was called to prophesy to the prophets, to teach to the teachers, to preach to the preachers. And I loved him. I loved Ezekiel. In chapter number 22, verse number 30, it says, "So I sought for a man among them who would make a wall and stand in the gap before me on behalf of the land, that I should not destroy it, but I found no one." You know why he found no one? Because no one had an altar. Everyone had lost their altar. No one had a place where they could stand in the gap for a nation. No one had the place where they could stand in the gap for a generation. That is an altar in your heart where you say, no one can get this. Not a spouse, not a child, not a mother, not a father. No one can touch this part of my heart, because it's an altar to God where I can stand in the gap for nations. As a leader, we are called to stand in the gap. We're called to have consecration, discipline, servanthood, vision, compassion, trustworthiness, decisiveness, wisdom, courage, and passion. But all that is stemmed from an altar, a place where we can go and only us and God can be in communion. It is a place where you build your relationships. That is what an altar is. And as a leader, we must understand that we must have an altar, because rapping and singing and praise dancing and preaching and teaching and ministering, all that's fine and dandy, but we are called to reconcile a nation back to God. And the only way we can truly reconcile a nation back to God is not through the singing and the dancing and the preaching and all of that. That's good, but we must have an altar, because in 2 Chronicles 7:14, he said, "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive them of their sins and heal their land." This nation, our generation, needs a healing. They need a healing that's not going to come in our teaching. They need a healing that's not going to come in our preaching. They need a healing that's not going to come in our dancing. Because, yeah, that's fine, but that's only reaching to the people that already come into the knowledge of God. We need to reach the people that haven't. So we must have an altar where we can say, you know what, I'm going to humble myself. An altar is where you humble yourself. You say, I decrease so God can increase. An altar is a place where you can pray and seek the face of God. An altar is a place where you can come out of the world. It's a place where you can come out of wicked ways and you can actually hear from heaven, and so that God can do what he's wanting to do through the earth. That's what we're here for. We're here for vessels, for God's glory, for God to use us in the way that he wants us to be used. But the only way for him to use us like that is we must have a place of altar. We must have an altar in our heart where we decrease so he can increase, so his work, his glory can be revealed through us, because it's not about us. It's about the people, the souls of the kingdom. We must be kingdom minded. We must be soul minded, which means that if we're going to think about the souls that need to come into the kingdom, we must have an altar where we can pray, where we can humble ourselves, where we can seek God's face, where we can turn from our wicked ways so God can hear from heaven and heal the land. This is what we need. Our land needs a healing. We live in a land where there's broken homes, father and motherless homes. People are being raped and molested by trusted family members. We live in a place where people are relying on gangs, promiscuity, homosexuality to fill a void that only God can fill. And so we must go back to the place of our altar. We must not get too caught up in this journey like Abram had to do. We must go back to our altar. We must go back to the place where we sing God. We must go back to the place where we can hear from God. We must go back to the place where we can get direction and counsel on how to get souls. We must go back to the place where we can trust God, where we can really, 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 really hear from God, hear the voice of God with no distractions. And the only place that is an altar within our heart. Not the place in the church, not the place in the building, but the place in our heart. We are the church, and the altar is within us. And we must get back to that place. We must turn from our wicked ways. We must humble ourselves. We must pray and seek God's face on our altar in our heart, that we may allow God to hear from heaven and heal a land. This word This word is so powerful, and I pray that you get it. And I just pray that it ministers to you, it imparts into you the seriousness of having an altar. When Abram lost his altar, he lost all sense of conviction. He lost all sense of integrity. We can't lose our altar as men and women of God. We have too many souls connected to us.